In this section, we're going to dig into the evaluation of sourcing opportunities by starting out with these macro considerations that we defined in our previous section. Let's jump right in. As we note from our title, we're jumping into now these macro considerations. One of the first that sometimes gets overlooked is the actual geography of the region or country that we're considering sourcing from. Example, the distance from that country, from the origin country to destination markets. How far away in kilometers or miles is the country we're looking at from the United States? If we also have business interests in Europe, how far is that? Latin America, how far is that? We're talking about the distance from the country we're looking at to buy from to our markets, whether it's to a manufacturing site, a distribution center, etc. How about the distance within that country from the sourcing region or location to ports or airports of export? The bigger the country, the greater the consideration. We can't just assume that a vendor that we're buying from is in close proximity to an ocean port or airport. It doesn't work like that. We need to be taking that into consideration. Another is topography. We'll see in a real-world example in just a moment the importance of considerations like mountains and deserts and their potential impact on our sourcing activities. Weather, that goes along with geography, but it's another issue that U.S. importers sometimes overlook. That is a mistake. For obvious reasons, seasonal changes in weather. Countries or regions that have different seasons, Europe being a good example, dealing with snow, rain, etc. How about countries in Asia and even Latin America that go through rainy seasons? This could have a huge impact on access to factories in those very countries and regions. Droughts, an unfortunate reality today. What does that do to sourcing strategies? Transportation restrictions, the ability to move goods at different times of the year. Bridges can be washed out. Tunnels can be flooded. That's what we're talking about, transport restrictions. Access seasonally, as we see in our last sub-bullet point, to roads, ports, and airports, for the very reasons we just alluded to. It is quite common to see in places like Latin America, Africa, and Asia, that roads will get washed out. And we're working with vendors that have a dirt road leading to their factory that literally cuts them off from the world should there be a flood, a monsoon, etc. We need to be thinking about these things. Other weather-related macro considerations, extreme swings in temperature, and what that can do to our product. From a humidity perspective, as we see in our second sub-bullet point, but also maybe we import paint. Paint can freeze. What do extreme swings in temperature do to our sourcing strategy? Catastrophic events. We talked a bit about monsoons, typhoons, tsunamis, tornadoes, even here in the United States, and hurricanes as well. We need to be thinking about those things. And unfortunately, the impact of climate change on longer-term weather patterns and what that does to our sourcing strategy. Let's throw out a real-world example that illustrates some of these points. Key factors for sourcing in the country of Colombia. In 2012, the United States entered into a free trade agreement, also known as a trade promotion agreement, with the country of Colombia. With reciprocal access to one another's domestic markets, many U.S. importers began investigating the sourcing of goods in Colombia. One such company was the Walter Dyer Leather Company of Lynn, Massachusetts. A longtime fabricator of U.S. origin leather goods, Dyer was now looking at sourcing from a number of suppliers in and around the city of Villavicencio, just south of the capital city of Bogota. Two things the Dyer sourcing team learned about Colombia were the importance of changes in both topography and weather as goods made their way north to the port city of Cartagena, and how those changes impacted factors like cumulative lead times and product integrity. The map on the following page helps to illustrate this point. Well, the first thing we need to do, and we said this previously, is determine where Villavicencio is relative to its distance from the United States, Lynn, Massachusetts in our case, but also its distance from ports of export. As a point of interest, Colombia is the only South American country that has a Pacific coast and an Atlantic coast, albeit via the Caribbean Sea. Working with our potential vendors in that Villavicencio area, we have to make determinations about what port of export to use. Cartagena was mentioned in the example, but what about Santa Marta? What about Barranquilla? What about the Pacific Ocean? It's not shown here, but the port of Buenaventura. Those are important considerations. What we're talking about here is the topography and changes in climate as goods proceed from Villavicencio up to Cartagena, from cool temperature to high temperature to high humidity in given regions. People don't realize that Colombia actually has snow-capped mountains. How do these different extremes impact not only our lead times, but also product integrity? These are the things that we need to be thinking about, and a fundamental understanding of geography is a good place to start. Continuing on with other macro considerations, political structure. What is the political model of a given country that we're looking at? Is it a democracy? Is it socialist? Is it communist, like China, for example? And what impact, if any, does that political structure have on our sourcing decisions? How many political parties are there? Is there turmoil politically in a given country? Who's in charge right now? Who's the ruling political party? And what is their attitude towards international trade? And something we might not think so much about here in the United States, but what are the election cycles in the countries we're looking for? Because changes in administrations in foreign countries can be a very big deal. Also, the length of term of a president. Is it 4 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 6 years? And how long are trade policies likely to be in place? Things we might not think of, but pretty important from a macro consideration perspective. Other issues around political structure. What are the integrity of their elections? What's the level of corruption? That has a lot to do with what we've talked about previously, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Will we be subject to corruption or potential corruption? Human rights record, super important. And the rule of the military in political structure. Not a big consideration in the United States. That does not mean it isn't important in other countries. It really is. As a trade tip, if we're looking at sourcing in Central America, for example, it is important to know that Costa Rica is the only country in the region without a military. What does that even mean? Well, for one thing, if Costa Rica doesn't have to spend money on its military, perhaps it can invest in infrastructure, in better education for its workers, etc. Again, in the U.S., we might not think about these things. In other countries, they are very, very important. Costa Rica not having a military is a big deal and might explain why, in relative terms, in Central America, why Costa Rica is more advanced than other countries. We need to know these things as sourcing professionals. Geopolitical circumstances. What is going on in these countries from a political perspective? Is there a history of civil unrest, revolutions, coup attempts, etc.? Clearly, that's going to have a lot to do with decisions we make from a sourcing perspective. Any recent uprisings, political coups, as we said? Are there any ongoing ethnic and or religious conflicts? Unfortunately, these conflicts exist in many countries around the world. We need to be cognizant of them when we make sourcing decisions. What relationships do countries have with bordering countries? Especially if we're sourcing from a landlocked country that has to truck goods through other countries to get to a port of export. That's a big deal for us. How do the countries we're looking at get along with their neighbors? And as such, last sub-bullet point here, what is the probability, if any, of regional conflicts and or wars? Because that would be very disruptive to an inbound supply chain. Let's illustrate some of these points by bringing out a real-world example. Key factors for sourcing in Myanmar. And we have a little map down here to give some geographic perspective as to where Myanmar is. In recent years, the country of Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, has emerged as a potential source for labor-intensive products like wearing apparel. With over 54 million people and a young workforce, Myanmar could join other Asian countries like Cambodia and Indonesia as a major producer of textile goods. All very positive for Myanmar. However, as companies conduct their macro analysis of Myanmar, they should not overlook the civil strife that has plagued the country for decades. Run by a military junta until 2011, the country's contemporary history has unfortunately been marred by poverty, ethnic clashes, and religious conflict. These things matter from a human rights perspective, but the stark reality is that they also matter from a sourcing perspective. Whereas Myanmar's prospects have improved in recent years, Sourcing professionals cannot ignore the macro-level factors that influence country-specific decision-making processes. This is a good example of some of the considerations we've mentioned thus far. Here is another supply chain perspective that deals with where do we find all this information about countries long before we even think about traveling to these countries to evaluate them in person. A good example of that is the CIA World Factbook, a resource that few American companies are actually aware of its existence. The internet is a great tool for conducting research on sourcing opportunities in specific countries. While it is very important for executives to travel to countries where they are considering vendor relationships, internet research provides a wealth of information that can help narrow the search long before a plane ticket is ever bought. One such internet tool is the CIA World Factbook. And yes, if you're wondering, it's that CIA that puts together this factbook. Published by the Central Intelligence Agency and available online without charge, the World Factbook provides detailed information on 267 world entities, mostly countries, but quasi-countries too. Sourcing professionals can use the category-specific capabilities of the tool to research a country's history, people, demographics, government structure, economy, energy sector, geography, communications infrastructure, on and on, transportation capabilities, and military presence. An excellent tool that already categorizes these macro considerations for us. Visual examples of how to use the CIA World Factbook are on the following slides. Well, of course, it should be no surprise that we're going to focus in on Myanmar. That's what we were just talking about. So when we go to the World Factbook webpage, we can type in a country name, and this is what's going to pop up. A little geographic perspective, the flag of the country, but also a breakdown. You'll see in the tabs about the country, references, appendices, which can provide us with other sources of information. Just a well-organized tool. In the case of Myanmar, which they actually still refer to as Burma, don't ask why, but it's still referred to as Burma in the CIA World Factbook, we can see the breakdown. We can see the categorization. And it's really a point-and-click type of situation where one can see an introduction, geography. In our case, we clicked on people and society. We can focus in on population. In our example on Myanmar, we mentioned a population of 55 million people. That's where this came from. It breaks it down demographically, provides some notes along the way. We can see by nationality, by ethnic groups, and maybe start to understand why there is ethnic and or religious conflict in the country, and perhaps in what regions in the country these are taking place. We can learn about languages, religions, etc. The point is that the CIA World Factbook is a great tool, pre-categorized tool for understanding macro considerations for sourcing decisions. That wraps up this section. When we return, we'll continue on with macro considerations, starting off with rule of law.